Okay, we are talking today another piece of DM advice. Today we're talking about how to improve the flow of your game. And we are going to be doing this through outsourcing our busy work to the players. Now, busy work, this is like a negative connotation word that I'm using for like comedic effect, but it does like encapsulate a lot of what the active like game time, like what you are sitting down and doing as a DM, like at the table is taken up by. So like all the dice math that's being added up and like looking through books and like anything else that could conceivably be accomplished by any given player. And this is not necessarily like a unique thing that I've come up with. This is like a piece of DM sage advice that's been passed down through forever. This is more so just my take on outsourcing the busy work. And I have found like the more that I have done this, it's only been like positive. Like the more that I do this, I've been like giving more and more DM responsibilities to my players with each passing session, and I've just been finding that it's been working better and better and improving how my DM time is spent at the table. Okay. So, how are we improving the flow? We're doing this by forcing players to do more stuff. So, like, as a DM, you really want to minimize the amount of time you're spending at the table you're devoting to doing math and book reading, and you really want to maximize the amount of time that you are spending just working on making the session interesting and or fun and or tense and or just a good story, rather than being a human calculator and or a human control F function. So you want to be spending as much time as possible making creative and narrative decisions. And so because of this, you want to move all the busy work onto your players. And now you might be thinking, like, okay, well, that seems kind of unfair. Why am I forcing my players to do the busy work? Like, shouldn't they be spending their time thinking of creative and narrative decisions too? And yes, they should be. So let's assume that both the players and the DM are both spending an equal amount of time at the table doing stuff. So like 50% of the time, DM is playing and doing stuff, 50% of the time, the players are doing stuff. Now let's assume that you've got like an average good-sized party of 5 players. So that 50% of the time that the players are playing, split up amongst the 5 of them, if we assume that they all are playing and participating in equal amount, that means 10% of any given session, players are talking and rolling dice and making decisions and writing stuff and playing the game. And then 90% of the time is just dead time. 90% of the time, they are just sitting there and waiting for their turn. Maybe they spend some of that 90% thinking about creative and narrative stuff in the like very limited scope that they have, that they can like manipulate that as a player. And otherwise that 90% is just like, so maybe if they spend like 10% of that time, which I think is generous, like if they're spending 10% of the time actively playing and then 10% of the time thinking about what they might want to do when it's their turn, or like just in general, that still means there is 80% of the time of the session is just a dead time that they are sitting there waiting. And I found that 80% is the reason why like people that don't like D&D, like if someone has tried D&D and they said, it's not my thing, it is almost certainly because of that 80% of the time that they are just sitting there and waiting. And that like 80% of the time, that's also the reason why I think why DMing is just so much more fun than being a player. Because like, yes, being a DM is more stressful and there's more responsibilities, and people are relying on you for basically this entire like activity going well and being fun, but you just get to like play the game the entire time. And whereas like when you're a player, like you just sit there and wait like for so much time. So we are doing every single thing in our power to utilize that 80% of dead time that players are just sitting there waiting. And We want to maximize the amount of time that the DM is thinking about interesting and practical and, storytelling stuff rather than just busy work. So you're going to try to split up that, try to make that player spend as much of that 80% of the time doing the DM's busy work. Okay, so this is like extra important, I have found, in like improv and or like episodic sessions. Because if you are just running a session off of like a bare minimum of like notes that you have prepared and or encounters, you want to like do everything within your power to make this feel like a full prepared completed session rather than just like 3 haphazard things that show up and that the players encounter and deal with and then they move on. You wanted this to feel like a complete story, any given adventure. You just don't want to feel like, okay, we were our characters and we did stuff for 3 hours and then it's over. You want things to feel like a full story, a full adventure with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so like, as the DM, ideally with all this time that you are saving by forcing your players to do busy work, you now have all this time that you can spend either writing down notes of things that have happened in the session and or reading your notes for either things that you want to have happen in the session and or things that have happened in the session. And then you want to take all these notes that you have in all their various forms and you want to try to connect them in a setup, reminder, payoff form, rule of threes, beginning, middle, end. Think about like, well, could I have this guy that they had show up at the beginning of the session? Could I have him show up again and then maybe have him show up later at the end of the session? Would that work? Or what about, my player had an idea, had a thought about something, like they expressed one of their personality traits. Maybe I can have that personality trait come up again. And then maybe at the end, I can have that personality trait like come to a conclusion or like have an effect on the story as a whole. Even if it's not like central tension, grand overarching story connections. Like for example, maybe if like a player, like at the beginning of a session, some player interacts with an elf and they express that they don't like elves, that they hate elves. You can work with that and then have somewhere in the middle of the session have this come up again and then be like, remind the rest of the table that this is a thing, that this player doesn't like elves. And then in the like last third of the session towards the end, have that like amount to something. Maybe have like an elf show up and then possibly offer help to the players. And now this player is either going to make a decision in that like this sort of conflict is going to be created and or this conflict is going to become more dangerous and escalated because they are refusing this elf's help, or they like have some sort of character development as they decide like, in this circumstance, I am actually going to set aside my hatred of elves so that we can work alongside him and have him, help us solve this conflict. But yeah, whether or not it's like a thing, like a magic item, maybe, or an NPC, or a location, or like a player's thoughts, like it could be super abstracted, but have something show up again in the middle of the session, and then have that amount to something at the end of a session. And this is something that I probably, like, maybe if you aren't improvising and you aren't doing like an episodic thing, you could sort of write something down for this that you think could work for the session. But if you don't have like anything fully prepared beforehand and you're just coming up with it extemporaneously, then I would, you want this beginning, middle, end to like really make the session feel complete and not just being the characters for 3 hours. Okay, so what are the things that we are forcing our players to do? The number one thing that I think saves a lot of time, it comes up especially a lot in like D&D, especially if you're having a lot of combat, is like math. Math can take up a lot of time and is really not something you want to be spending a lot of time as doing as the DM. You know, you do not want to just sit here functioning as the human calculator. Just tell a player to keep track of how much damage any given enemy is taken. So ways that you can do this: if you just put one of these little tokens, if you are using miniatures and you have a table set up and you need a means of keeping track of how much damage any individual monster is taken, you can use these little dry erase tokens and just like erase and rewrite the amount of damage that a monster takes as they take it. If it is all theater of the mind, then you can just have a player with a loose leaf piece of paper adding all this stuff up. And, but now, like, won't you have to tell your players and the monster's damage reduction, resistances, immunities, anything like that? And yes, you like that. That is just a sacrifice you're going to have to make in order for the players to be able to do this math. And I don't really think that this is a problem at all. Like, if your player tries to stab a sword or tries to stab a ghost with their sword, then you will just straight up have to tell them definitively, like, it had this effect on the ghost, which maybe you want to keep it like a surprise, and maybe like you want to, well, not necessarily a surprise, but you don't want to make it definitive and tell them like, okay, well, you know, it has some effect, but you don't know if it was like 10% effective, 50% effective. Like, maybe you should consider another means. Like, you will just straight up have to tell them like it took 50% of its, you know, of the regular damage you would have dealt. And so there's an argument against this. I don't think it's worth it. I think the amount of time you will save by just having the players keep track of all of it is just so much, it very much so outweighs the cost of that sort of secrecy of knowing how the monsters work, that sort of surprise factor, I suppose. And because I guess there is like an element of realism of like, well, you don't actually 100% know. You wouldn't know exactly how much it's having an effect. But I think, like, you know, if a player stabs a ghost with a sword, they should be able to tell if there's any amount of like resistance, and or if this creature's incorporeal form is in any way being disrupted by this piece of steel slashing through it. So I don't even think it's that big of a deal. Like, I think there's this like an equal argument for why it does make sense for the players to just straight up know all of this stuff as they figure it out, as they try it out, and just being told definitively how this is like being mechanically reflected. So yeah, I would just say just have players keep track of how much damage they've dealt to any given monster. Now, adding up dice. This could be another one. If you just roll like 12d12, sometimes it's just better to have a player start adding up all those numbers on the dice so that you can start like rereading a monster's ability, making sure you know how it works or what have you. Now, obviously, like with anything, your like intonation and or like your emotion, or like basically how you are like going about your temperament as you do anything can have, a meaning, can insinuate meaning, I suppose. Like if you roll a bunch of dice and you just sit there and like have them like tell them like, okay, add it up, and then you're like, yep, yeah, that's right, you take 72 fire damage, like if you do that, make sure you realize what point you were getting across by adding up the numbers in that way. And so like I would generally try to avoid doing that, and more so like make it clear that like you are having them add up the numbers so that you can take care of this next step in the process. They are doing math, and not just so like you are forcing them to do the math just to like, haha, like screw you, Okay, the next roll I have. Oh, right. Something else I should say about all of these roles and these tasks is that I wouldn't necessarily assign a single player to be the dedicated math doer I would just, roll the dice and or like straight up tell someone, like kind of like in a situation where apparently, or not apparently, but like in an emergency and you need someone to call 911, you don't just scream out into the open like somebody call 911. You have to like point at someone specifically and tell them like, hey, you call 911. Otherwise, like everyone is just going to assume that someone else is going to do it. So you need to point to a player and tell him like, and or her and or they, I guess. Okay. Tell them like, track this enemy's health. Like you are responsible for this, or like you are responsible for adding up this specific dice roll. But any player could be taking care of any task at any time. There's not a dedicated math to it. Placer of terrain. If you are playing with terrain, you don't want to have to spend like 5 minutes as the DM placing individual hills and trees and making sure exactly everything is where it should be. Just like put a bunch of stuff on the table and just like start telling the players like, okay, start arranging this in like a hills type of scene, or like start making a dense forest with these trees or what have you. And conceivably the players might set this up in a way that will be advantageous to them. They'll make a perfect spot for their archer to snipe from or whatever. But as the DM, you'll probably be choosing where they're going to be entering from, and then you're going to be placing like the monsters and what have you afterwards. So yeah, but just like placing terrain, it's a thing that the players can be doing that you really don't have to be doing as a DM. Yeah, so just, anything to use that 80% of the session that they're just sitting there. Okay. Also, this has like the slight double bonus of like they're getting a little bit more of an opportunity to sort of story tell, if you will. They're getting their like tiny little opportunity in their little microcosm to be able to do their own DMing within the session by placing the terrain. So, they get a little bit more invested as they've had more of themselves put into the game, even if it's on a very tiny scale. It's better than nothing. Okay, so, all right. Technically, actually, the number 3 job, now that I've added that placer of the terrain on the last line. But anyways, the book looker upper. I think this is an extremely, like, insidious sort of factor that can either, like, make or break how much fun people are having at any given time with a session. Because there's just, when I am a player in a session and this occurs, it's just, I, like, get filled with dread. As soon as someone opens up a book, and I just can tell, like, okay, so the next 30 seconds to a minute is going to be spent with all of us sitting here waiting as this DM is flipping through the book, looking for the right page, reading the ability, then giving us their interpretation of how this ability works. It's just, I hate having that feeling of sitting there and knowing that, like, we are all just waiting and watching some dude read. So I would do, now there's multiple things you can do to avoid this. I think you should do any and all of them. Either A, have another player just read the book, look it up, and continue the game while they're doing that. Or B, just give your judgment call, your interpretation, and just, have all the players play with that. Because otherwise, like, just the reading of the book, it just feels so bad. And something I will say is that I've homebrewed my D&D 5e, or like this, my system, so much to the point that it's like almost like its own game at this point. They're like, it has the same 6 core abilities and the same core D20 system, and most of the skills are the same, but like other than that, like so much has been changed. And I've like did my own take on every single class and their abilities and everything, and it's been a major help and almost entirely worth it alone for the reason that I've never ended up in a situation where a player has like tried to argue, not even argue, but there has been a back and forth of like, I'm pretty sure this ability works this way, because it is just a definitive like, no, I know I wrote everything and these abilities that everyone is using, so I know exactly how everything works. And like, even if I don't personally exactly 100% remember the actual text they had written for any given ability, just whenever I say that any ability works a given way, everyone has no reason to just not believe it, and they will just go along with what I say. And it has been, yeah, just like monumentally helpful in that, like, I have basically like cut down any looking into rule books for exact wordings and how things work to like almost zero. Like maybe once every couple of sessions I will have to crack open my PDF and look up exactly how I worded an ability. But yeah, almost all of the time I've just completely like foregone any of that with the writing of my own like system and abilities and yada yada. And okay, so another thing that like maybe an excuse and an argument for book reading is that it adds the sort of tool in your arsenal to be able to like hold up the book and read through it and react to like, oh my god, he can do that, or like this spell does this or that, or like, you know, and you can sort of use that as sort of like an artificial source of tension, where like, you know, everyone is sitting waiting with bated breath and seeing your response to how you're reading the book, which I guess technically you can still do, so I think it still remains a tool in your arsenal if you wanted to do that. But I do think it's kind of unearned attention. It's not really tied into the story at all, or even like the mechanics of the game. This is literally is tied into your acting ability and reading the mechanics of the game, which maybe newer players this can sort of work with, but with any like more experienced player that understands how kind of like artificial and like unearned it is, and you know, something like, oh, but like, oh, the meta aspect is just as valuable as the, you know, in-universe diegetic aspect of the game. And I would say generally avoid it, but just to know that it is something available to you if you want to use it. Okay, so the DJ, this one might be the most controversial, but I think it's still worth it. So, you know, don't sit here finagling with your music and your phone and what have you, trying to play the right song for any given moment. Just assign a player to take care of and handle music. You know, when an action scene occurs, you can just tell them like, hey, play action music, or, you know, play like emotional music, you know, play that Interstellar soundtrack or whatever. And like this, you know, this does have more of an effect of like the tone and the atmosphere of the game. Like, you are really giving a player a lot of power. Like, just think about any given movie and how much the music and the score has worked to like set the tone for either the movie as a whole or for a scene in particular, and just how much that music can change your perception of that like given scene or what have you. So this one is like pretty important, and you know, you definitely want to like give this to a player that you think does have a proper understanding of the session, the scene, like storytelling as a whole, and like the campaign in particular, because this one, if you choose the wrong player, things can go south quickly. You know, my little joke example here is like, you know, you have an emotional scene and then a player they mistake their role as the minstrel, as the jester, and think, how can I use this to get a rise out of everyone? How can I use this to be the funny guy and get a reaction and make everyone at the table laugh? Whereas the DM, you might not want to be setting up this scene where everyone is laughing at this joke, because tensions are high. Maybe they think things are awkward. Maybe they don't want to have to pretend that this is like emotional, and that they don't want to be in this awkward, like, vulnerable position. So they're going to deflect and just turn this into like a humorous situation. So if there's an intensely emotional scene that you're trying to have as a DM, then a player decides to, or specifically the minstrel decides to play a song that destroys all the tension. What is your response to that? Well, this is where, like, trusting your players comes into play. Like, you need to be able to trust your players, and just imagine that they are trying to get the same thing out of this game that you are trying to get out of it. The entire foundation of the game is built on trust. And if you don't have this inherent, innate, like, trust in your players and their, like, playing of the game and their take on it, and how that relates to your as a DM's take on the game, if you're missing that trust, then you have got a much bigger problem than like what you have going on, or than flow of the game. You've got something way bigger you have to be taking care of before you take care of, like, oh, well, let me try to make my game as perfect as possible. Okay, so in conclusion, min-max how you spend your time as a DM. You want to be spending as little time taking care of calculations and computer work and busy work that your players could conceivably be doing. And you want to give your players as much responsibility and as much of an ability as you possibly can. Fill up that 80% of dead time that they are spending doing nothing with as much work as you possibly can from as a DM. And people bring up food a lot, so I figure why not give everyone the reminder. Have people figure out food beforehand. Don't let people's thoughts get distracted by the handling of food and hunger and all of that, rather than the game itself. All right, so hopefully something here has been helpful for you. I'll see you next time.